The postmodernists, they're the logical conclusion of the Nietzschean dilemma. God is dead. The value structure collapsed. The specter arises of all value structures collapsing. That's the postmodernist dogma. All value structures have collapsed. They're only there for the purposes of exclusion. They have no intrinsic value. It's a very, very powerful argument. That's why it dominates the universities. That and the fact that it allows people to dispense with their moral responsibility, which is something that's never discussed by the postmodernists. But you have to give the devil his due. What's the problem with postmodernism? Well, if all value structures have collapsed, then there's nothing to do. Because in order to do something, one thing has to be better than another, because otherwise, why do it? And so people who are ensconced in the postmodern tradition are undermined by their own philosophy. They can deconstruct their own deconstruction, in which case they might as well just sit there and do nothing, which would actually be preferable to what they're doing now. So how do they extract themselves from that dilemma? They do it illogically, but they don't care. Because the postmodernists, first of all, don't believe in logic. That's a reflection of the logos, which they've dispensed with. Dialogue they don't believe in, because that's a reflection of the logos, which they've dispensed with. Logic and dialogue are irrelevant. Well, that does bring up the problem of what to do. Well, the postmodernists finesse that by reverting to the Marxist doctrines from which postmodernism emerged. And so they say, well, yeah, you can't get any direction from postmodernism, but we're not going to worry about that because we don't worry about such things. What we'll do is just use sleight of hand to push forward the communitarian doctrines out of which our original hypothesis emerged. And everyone says, well, we'll turn a blind eye to the paradox because we actually need something to do. And plus, to the degree that we're communitarian, we can take out our nihilistic resentment and arrogance and ingratitude on every single person we deem to have something more than we have. And so if you're wondering why certain values can exist in the absence of any value, you have to look no farther than to understand that people who are desperate and chaotic will still be angry and destructive. And they can manifest that perfectly with the moral mask that says, well, I'm not really after what you have, because you have a little more than me. I'm speaking on behalf of these people who have even less. It's like, it's absolute nonsense. It's so funny watching Yale students complain about the privileged. They're in the top 1/10 of 100% of people who've lived in the entire history of the planet, much less just the people that are on the planet now. They're dominating patriarchs in training, right? They're baby representatives of the patriarchy. And all they do is complain about that tiny, tiny, infinitesimal fraction of people who have slightly more than they have now. It's appalling. And their idiot professors pat them on the back and send them out the world to do that instead of teaching them how to live. The alternative is a proper return to the past, and that is precisely to journey into the chaos, to look at the worst possible thing, and to pull the dead father up from the chaotic depths. That's how you stop being a puppet. Someone whose strings are being pulled by forces they do not understand behind the scenes. You find out what's great about your culture, this thing that's provided us with everything that we see in this room, this amazing warmth that we're experiencing when it's 30 bloody below outside, the fact that the electricity is on and the computational resources are working and that we can all sit here peacefully and that no one is hungry. In fact, we're too fat. That's our big problem. Oh no, we have so much stuff we're getting fat. Yeah, well, that's a good problem to have. We should have some gratitude for what's been produced that's brought us to this point, and we need to wake up and understand what we're doing. That's what the psychoanalysts were trying to do in the 20th century. That's what all the great clinicians were trying to do, and I would say, above all else, that was what Carl Jung was trying to do. He believed firmly that the idea of the divine spark within the individual was a metaphysical reality, by which he meant a reality that actually transcended and existed superordinate to the physical reality, a more real reality. That's whatever consciousness is. something we understand from a scientific perspective? Not at all. It's been represented in our mythologies as far back as we can push them as an independent agent in the world, giving rise to form. That's how we treat each other. That's how we recognize ourselves. That's how we judge each other. You make your bed, and then you lie in it. And everyone knows it. And that's not to say that you're not subject to random and chaotic circumstances and the tragedy of life. Just because you can do some things doesn't mean you can do everything. But you can do some things, and if you don't do them, then things fall apart. God, in the highest sense, is the spirit that you must emulate in order to thrive. How's that for a biological definition? Spirit is a pattern. The spirit that you must emulate in order to thrive. It's an animating principle. Yeah, it's a meta, it's a pattern. And you might say, well, what's the pattern? Okay, well, I can tell you that to some degree. Imagine that, like you're gripped by beauty, you're gripped by admiration. So, and you can just notice this. This isn't propositional. You have to notice it. It's like, oh, turns out I admire that person. So what does that mean? Well, it means I would like to be like him or her. That's what admiration means. It means there's something about the way they are that compels imitation, another instinct, or inspires respect or awe even. Okay, what is that grips you? Well, I don't know. Well, let's say, okay, fine, but it grips you and you want to be like that. Kids hero worship, for example, and so do adults for that matter, unless they become entirely cynical.
I worship quite a few heroes.
Yeah, well, there you go.
Proudly.
Yes, well, there you go. And there's no, that worship, that celebration and proclivity to imitate is worship. That's what worship means most fundamentally. Now imagine you took the set of all admirable people and you extracted out AI learning. You extracted out the central features of what constitutes admirable. And then you did that repeatedly until you purified it to what was most admirable. That's as good as you're going to get in terms of a representation of God. So I did a lecture series on Genesis, and I got a lot of it unpacked, but by no means all of it. When God kicks Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden, he puts cherubim with flaming swords at the gate to stop human beings from re-entering paradise. I thought, what the hell does that mean, cherubim? And why do they have flaming swords? I don't get that. What is that exactly? And then I found out from Matthew Pageau, who wrote a great book on symbolism in Genesis, that cherubim are the supporting monsters of God. It's a very complicated idea. And that they're partly a representation of that which is difficult to fit into conceptual systems. They've also got an angelic or demonic aspect. Take your pick. Why do they have flaming swords? Well, a sword is a symbol of judgment and the separation of the wheat from the chaff. Use a sword to cut away and to carve. And a flaming sword is not only that which carves, it's that which burns. And what does it carve away and burn? Well, you want to get into paradise? It carves away everything about you that isn't perfect. And so what does that mean? Okay, well, here's part of what it means. This is a terrible thing. So you could say that the entire Christian narrative is embedded in that image. Why? Well, let's say that flaming swords are a symbol of death. That seems pretty obvious. Let's say further that they're a symbol of apocalypse and hell. That doesn't seem completely unreasonable. So here's an idea. Not only do you have to face death, you have to face death and hell before you can get to paradise. Hellish judgment. And all that's embedded in that image. And a piece of art with an image like that has all that information in it. And it shines forth in some fundamental sense. It reaches into the back tendrils of your mind at levels you can't even comprehend and grips you. I mean, that's why people go to museums and gaze at paintings they don't understand. And that's why they'll pay, what's the most expensive objects in the world? If it's not carbon fiber racing yachts, it's definitely classic paintings. right? It's high level technological implements.